Bear markets. How do you survive them? I'm Elliot Apple, founder and financial planner of Kindness Financial Planning, and we're going to talk about everything related to bear markets today. And just to be upfront, this isn't going to be a very technical video. It's going to be more on the emotional side of bear markets and how to survive them. Why is it important to learn about bear markets? Well, you're likely to go through them multiple times in your lifetime. They tend to happen every so often, and knowing what to expect going into one can be helpful, and also knowing what the headlines are going to look like, how you might feel. That way it can help you know if what you're experiencing currently is okay. So what is a bear market? A bear market is technically defined when the stock market drops by 20% or more. And when I talk about the stock market, there's lots of different stock market indices out there. So you could be looking at things like the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones or some other benchmark. So just know that going in is one stock market indice could be in a bear market while another isn't. It's also important to remember that these are technical definitions, and it's always a little bit funny to me just because at 20% you're in a bear market, but at 19.9% you're technically not in a bear market. And so there's this arbitrary benchmark that 20% is a bear market, whereas 19.9% wouldn't be. But it's just important to remember that it is going to feel the same. 19.9% versus 20% is going to feel awful both ways. It doesn't matter. There's nothing magical that happens at a 20% trigger that you didn't necessarily experience at 19.9 or even 19 or the percentage drops leading up to that. It can all be a painful experience on the way down, but you should know what a technical definition is because the headlines start getting a little bit over the top, if you will, once you hit that 20% threshold, whereas leading up to it, they can't technically call it a bear market at that point, so the headlines are maybe a little less scary. I also think it's important to understand some of the statistics behind bear markets, because if you know the stats going into it, it may help provide some context to what you're experiencing currently. For example, between 1928 and 2021, the S&P 500 has been in a bear market 26 times. Now, what's interesting to note about that is that recessions and bear markets don't always go hand in hand. During the same time period, there have only been 15 recessions, so a bear market doesn't always necessarily mean a recession. Bear markets tend to occur about every 3.6 years on average. The average length of a bear market is just shy of 10 months. Between 1928 and 1945, bear markets occurred about once every 1.4 years. Between 1945 and 2021, bear markets occurred about once every 5.4 years. So you can see that as time has gone on, bear markets are occurring less frequently than they did in the past. Bear markets can vary significantly in the amount that the stock market drops. If you go back to the Great Financial Crisis, the drop there was about 57%. If you compare that to the Great Depression, stocks dropped about 90% during that time period. It's really important to look at the headlines during past stock market declines and past bear markets just to see what the news is reporting, because remember, their primary goal is to get you to tune into their network and to create fear, so that way you keep coming back. So there's going to be lots of flashing things and red signs and anything that evokes that fear emotion and just draws you in. And so looking at these past headlines, you can look at them. It's been going on forever. We can go back to the 1800s, and even then, similar headlines you'd see during these time periods that were meant to evoke fear. Now, these headlines that you just saw, they're pretty tame compared to what you'll see in some blogs and online articles today. They can get really over the top. I think these are sort of middle of the ground, if you will. Obviously they're meant to evoke emotion, and that's important to keep in mind. So as you read news articles going through a bear market or any stock market decline, remember what their primary intent is. It's to get you to tune back into their network, their article, whatever media that you're watching or listening or reading, they want you back. And so just keep that in mind, that it's probably not the best pieces of information or the best source to go to during a stock market decline, because it's going to be fearful, and that is on purpose. There are a few tricks that you should pay attention to when you're reading headlines or you're reading any news articles. The media loves to quote things in terms of points, and it is a terrible way to look at it, because with points, 1,000 points may sound like a ton, but if you do that on a percentage basis, it may not be as high. 1,000 points might be 0.5% or 1%. It depends on what the indice is out of. But it's an important thing to keep in mind, because I can quote a point level and you have no idea what it's relative to, but it can sound like a lot. It's also important to keep in mind that there will always be an expert to support anybody's side of the story. So when you see fancy credentials, a good education, great work experience, there's always going to be someone with that can support either side of the story. So take it with a grain of salt anytime that you see an expert on TV talk about something. The media is meant to find people who will support different sides of that, so that way there's something to be said within that story. Another thing to keep in mind is that stories are very powerful, and so oftentimes you'll hear stories or an analogy to another time period. Going back to COVID and the pandemic, people would often equate different things within their news articles to the Great Depression, how it was similar to the Great Depression or could be similar to the Great Depression. So just keep that in mind, that stories are very powerful, and whenever you're reading something, it's easy to make comparisons because you only need one or two things to make a comparison to a past time period, and it can look like there's going to be some sort of causation into the future, that this is going to cause that or this will cause that. So just keep that in mind as you're reading stories, that they are powerful and they're great for retaining information, but they're not always the best when we're having some sort of predictive power to say that this time period is going to be like another time period in the past. So what sort of emotion is normal to experience during a bear market? Basically the gamut. You can feel sad, you can feel angry, you can feel disappointed, you can feel lost or anxious, or like everything that you're doing isn't working to your benefit. It is normal to feel a whole range of emotions depending on what's going on. You might feel better as stock markets recover, but the actual economic data and the news that's coming out is not great. There's that dissonance there, that oftentimes the recovery comes before everything else is starting to feel good in the economy, and that can bring on guilt and other emotions associated with that. So I want to bring out to the forefront here that whatever emotion you're experiencing, it's probably normal. There can be a whole wide array of emotions during a stock market decline, and they can happen quickly, and so you can run that roller coaster of emotions really fast. The important thing to remember is that these emotions are normal. It's gonna feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. It is a normal part of investing. What can you do during a bear market? We've talked about how you'll feel, what the news might look like, but what are some steps you can actually take? 1, revisit your investment policy statement. If you don't have one, create one now. It's not the best time to be creating one, and you'll want to revisit it in the future, but the investment policy statement acts as a guidebook or a roadmap to how you should be investing. It can outline your stock to bond ratio. It can say which asset classes you own. It can give you a guideline for how you're selecting investments. It can tell you when you'll consider new investments or when you might want to stop using a certain asset class. It can talk about valuations if something's really expensive or really cheap, if you want to overweight or underweight. There's a lot of different ways to use an investment policy statement, but simply I like to think of it as a roadmap. So it's telling you exactly what to do during these time periods, and you don't have to worry about what choices you're making because you've already determined in a better state that this is the way that you want to invest. And so it's not a surprise. You're not sort of being drawn into the latest investments or tempted to sell something that maybe is not in your best interest. 2, you can tune out the noise. And I know this one is easier said than done. It is hard to turn off the television. It is hard to stop reading the newspaper or online articles, but a lot of times it is best to just avoid that noise. And it is noise. We talked about the headlines earlier. It's really easy to get people to tune in and just mindlessly scroll or mindlessly listen to what is going on in the world. But for the most part, it's garbage. It truly is. Try to find something that is going to nourish your mind, that is going to be a helpful thing as opposed to a net negative. Number 3, journal your thoughts and feelings. This one is underrated, and I don't think enough people do this one. I did this during the COVID pandemic, and it was really helpful to be able to come back to that and see how I was feeling and what I was thinking during that time period. And if you do this long enough, when you go through the next bear market, you can revisit what you were feeling like in the past and see, hey, I'm feeling similarly now, or I'm feeling a little bit different, and you can see how that changed. If you do this daily, you can see how those emotions have changed, how the news changed, what you're consuming, and how that played into what you're feeling. So I really recommend journaling daily, if not more frequently. And I'd say not any less frequently than a week, because a lot can happen in a week during a bear market and during an economic decline. Number 4, take time for yourself. And I know this one is easier said than done, but similar to tuning out the noise, take time to do the things that you love. If that's going for a walk, going for a run, gardening, taking a drive, whatever it is you do to unwind, spend some time doing that. It is more important than ever during a bear market or a stock market decline to take that time for yourself. And if you've tried everything there is possible and you still are tempted to make a change during a bear market that you know probably isn't in your best interest, but you're tempted to do it anyway, try to make it a small change. So if you're tempted to sell some stocks during a stock market decline, instead of selling all your portfolio, maybe you only sell a portion of it. So there are minor adjustments that you can make that maybe that is enough to sort of satisfy your taste to do something, because I know for a lot of people during a bear market, they feel like they have to do something. So to the extent that you can limit that, it's normally better. And lastly, don't be afraid to seek out a second opinion or meet with a financial planner. These are the time periods where financial planners often meet with people because there is that doubt of, am I doing everything that I should be doing? Is there something else that I'm supposed to be doing with my investments during this time period? Can I reduce my taxes during this? Does a Roth conversion make sense? There are a lot of financial planning opportunities you can do during a stock market decline that you may want a second opinion on, that may be worth its value to do that. And so seek someone out to do that if you're feeling a little alone in the way that you're managing your investments or your financial life. To wrap things up, bear markets are uncomfortable. We know that. We're going to go through a whole range of emotions. The headlines are going to be awful. The media is going to use color and points and different things to help drive that emotion in you, which will make things worse. So to the extent that you can tune out the noise, I recommend it. Seek out a second opinion if needed, and remember to take time for yourself. It is very crucial during bear markets to do that. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want more of it, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel.